They laughed at him. They mocked him. To them, he was just a lowly delivery man, someone who didn't belong in their world. But what they didn't know was that the man they had humiliated would soon control their futures. And when the truth was revealed, their smiles disappeared. Respect costs nothing, but without it, you can lose everything. What happens when the man you underestimate turns out to be your boss? Stick around for a story of power, justice, and the ultimate lesson in respect. Don't forget to leave a comment sharing your thoughts and subscribe to the channel to stay updated with our latest videos, because the truth deserves to be told. The early morning sun bathed New York City in a golden hue, casting long shadows across the towering skyscrapers and bustling streets. The city was already alive, filled with the sounds of honking cabs, hurried footsteps, and the distant hum of conversation. Among the crowd moving through the heart of Manhattan, a man navigated his way toward an address he had been to before but never quite cared for. Marcus Carter, a broad-shouldered black man in his late 30s, stepped out of his delivery truck and adjusted the cap on his head. Dressed in his standard work uniform, a navy blue polo shirt with the company's logo stitched neatly on the chest, dark cargo pants, and sturdy work boots, he exuded quiet confidence. His posture was straight, his movements efficient. Marcus had been in this business for over a decade and had seen his fair share of restaurants, from hole-in-the-wall diners to Michelin-starred establishments. But Astoria Prime was something else entirely. The restaurant stood as a symbol of opulence. Its sleek, modern facade boasted floor-to-ceiling windows, behind which guests dined under the glow of crystal chandeliers. The golden letters spelling out Astoria Prime gleamed above the entrance, making it clear that this was no ordinary eatery. The clientele who frequented this place weren't just wealthy. They were the elite of New York, business moguls, celebrities, and politicians who expected only the finest service and cuisine. But while the exterior radiated class, the atmosphere behind the kitchen doors was something Marcus had come to recognize far too often, an air of exclusivity that had less to do with quality and more to do with hierarchy. Marcus maneuvered the heavy cart stacked with crates of fresh produce and seafood toward the side entrance, designated for deliveries. He had been to Astoria Prime before, but each visit felt the same. The kitchen staff, though never outright hostile, always exuded a certain coldness when dealing with delivery workers like him. It was a subtle form of discrimination, one that wasn't spoken aloud but hung thick in the air. As he pushed open the heavy metal door leading into the kitchen's receiving area, the scent of garlic, butter, and sizzling meat wafted through the air. The kitchen was already a hive of activity, chefs, sous chefs, and line cooks darting around in crisp white jackets, each engrossed in their prep work. The moment Marcus stepped inside, the stares began. A young sous chef, a wiry man with sharp cheekbones, looked up from his cutting board and immediately nudged the man beside him. The two exchanged knowing smirks before turning back to their work. A waitress, balancing a tray of freshly baked pastries, glanced at Marcus briefly, then wrinkled her nose slightly before hurrying past. Marcus had seen it all before. He wasn't naive. He knew what those looks meant. They weren't just about him being a delivery worker. No, there was something more to it. It was about who he was. A tall, imposing figure emerged from the far end of the kitchen. Richard Bennett, the head chef of Astoria Prime, was a man in his early 50s with a face that looked as though it had been permanently set to disapproving. His short salt and pepper hair was neatly combed back, and his white chef's coat was pristine, ironed to perfection. As soon as Bennett spotted Marcus, his lips curled slightly, not quite a sneer, but something close. "You're late," he said, his voice clipped and sharp. Marcus glanced at the clock mounted on the wall. 800 a.m. on the dot, the same time he was scheduled to arrive. "I'm right on time, chef," Marcus replied, his voice level. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the invoice. Fresh seafood and organic greens from Hudson Farms. Everything's accounted for. Bennett didn't even bother to look at the paper. Instead, he crossed his arms over his chest, eyeing Marcus as though he were an inconvenience rather than someone ensuring his restaurant had the finest ingredients for the day's service. "I don't care about the paperwork," Bennett scoffed. "Just unload it and don't block the kitchen entrance." Marcus suppressed a sigh. He had dealt with men like Bennett before, the kind who thrived on their perceived superiority. As Marcus began to unload the crates, he overheard whispers and chuckles from the kitchen staff. One of the junior chefs, a blonde woman in her mid-20s, leaned toward a coworker and muttered, "Guess they'll let just about anyone waltz in here these days." Another voice, male, chimed in, "Bet he's never even eaten at a place like this." Marcus' hands tightened momentarily around the crate he was holding, but he didn't say a word. He had learned long ago that people like this weren't worth his energy. Instead, he methodically continued his task, moving swiftly, stacking the goods where they needed to be. But then he caught something else. "I wonder if he even understands half the stuff he's delivering," someone whispered, followed by a low chuckle. That one stung more than he expected. It wasn't just about his job, it was about who they thought he was. Someone who didn't belong. Someone who wasn't worthy of being in their space. Marcus paused for a moment, straightened his posture and turned slightly, his dark brown eyes scanning the room. The chuckling ceased. He didn't have to say a word. The look he gave was enough. Despite the hostility, Marcus continued unloading the ingredients with practiced efficiency. He had always taken pride in his work, ensuring that each delivery was handled with care. These weren't just crates of produce to him. They were the backbone of what made restaurants like Astoria Prime function. Without the delivery workers, the fishermen, the farmers, there would be no fine dining. But none of that seemed to matter to the people here. Marcus finished stacking the last of the crates, wiped his hands on his pants, and turned back to Richard Bennett. "All set," he said evenly. "I just need you to sign for the delivery." Bennett barely glanced at him as he scribbled his signature across the invoice. "You can go now," he said curtly. Marcus took the paper, folded it neatly, and tucked it into his pocket. He turned toward the exit but then paused just before reaching the door. One of the waiters nearby muttered under his breath, "Yeah, go back where you came from." Marcus stopped. His grip on the door handle tightened slightly. The room grew quiet, the laughter dying down. Slowly, Marcus turned back, his gaze settling on the waiter who had spoken. His voice was calm, measured, but carried a weight that silenced the room. "I came here," he said, "to deliver something you all clearly need more of, respect." With that, Marcus turned and stepped out, leaving behind a kitchen full of stunned faces. What they didn't know, what none of them could have possibly guessed, was that the next time Marcus walked into Astoria Prime, he wouldn't be a delivery man. He would be their boss. Marcus Carter had been in the food delivery business for over a decade, and he had seen all kinds of people. Some were polite and professional, treating him with the same respect they expected in return. Others, like the employees of Astoria Prime, believed they were above him simply because of where they worked. He could feel their stares as he began unloading the crates of fresh produce and seafood, each box carefully packed to meet the restaurant's strict standards. He worked efficiently, placing the goods where they needed to go without getting in anyone's way. But despite his professionalism, the murmurs started almost immediately. Standing near the prep station, a young sous chef with sharp cheekbones leaned toward a co-worker, his voice just loud enough for Marcus to hear. "Someone like him doesn't belong in a place like this." Marcus didn't react. He had learned long ago that responding to ignorance only fueled it. Instead, he kept stacking the crates, making sure everything was aligned properly. Another voice, this time from one of the waiters folding linen napkins, joined in. Bet he could never afford to eat here. A soft chuckle followed, and Marcus' grip on the crate tightened slightly. Not because their words surprised him. He had heard variations of the same insults many times before, but because of how comfortable they were saying them. They didn't even try to whisper. The sous chef smirked and casually flicked a stray piece of onion skin off the counter. You know, we should get these deliveries earlier. Don't want someone like him hanging around when guests start arriving. That comment did irritate Marcus, but he swallowed his frustration and focused on the task at hand. He had a job to do, and these people weren't worth his energy. As Marcus finished unloading, he grabbed the invoice from his clipboard and walked over to Richard Bennett, the head chef. Bennett, a tall man in his 50s with a permanent scowl, barely acknowledged Marcus as he reached for the invoice. He glanced at it for no more than a second before scribbling his signature without even looking up. Then, without a single word of thanks, he dismissed Marcus with a wave of his hand. Just get out of here. People like you don't belong here. Marcus froze for a brief moment. It wasn't just the dismissive wave or the lack of gratitude, it was those last few words. He knew what Bennett meant. It wasn't about delivery workers, it was about him. A smirk tugged at the corner of a nearby waiter's lips as he turned to a colleague and whispered loud enough for Marcus to hear, "Yeah, go back where you came from." That was it. Marcus stopped in his tracks, his fingers tightening slightly around the invoice. For the first time since stepping into Astoria Prime that morning, he turned around, his gaze sweeping over the kitchen staff. The laughter died instantly. The waiter who had made the last remark shifted uncomfortably under Marcus' stare. The sous chef suddenly found his knife more interesting than anything else in the room. Even Bennett, who was so quick to dismiss Marcus, looked up, sensing the change in atmosphere. Marcus didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. When he finally spoke, his words were clear and deliberate. "I came here to deliver something you all are clearly lacking: respect." A heavy silence filled the kitchen. No one dared to speak, and no one dared to laugh. Without another word, Marcus turned and walked toward the exit, his steps steady and unhurried. He didn't slam the door behind him. He didn't storm out in anger. But the weight of his presence lingered, leaving behind an unspoken challenge. They had spent the morning mocking him, underestimating him. What they didn't know, what none of them could have possibly imagined, was that the next time Marcus walked through the doors of Astoria Prime, he wouldn't be a delivery man. He would be their boss. Back outside, Marcus took a deep breath, inhaling the crisp morning air. He had been tested today, but he hadn't lost his patience. He had seen their true colors, and he knew exactly the kind of culture that thrived within those kitchen walls. But things were going to change. They just didn't know it yet. The afternoon air inside Astoria Prime was thick with curiosity and impatience. The restaurant, known for its high standards and exclusive clientele, had just been thrown off balance. A mandatory staff meeting had been announced, an unusual occurrence that left employees murmuring among themselves. Nobody knew what it was about, only that attendance was non-negotiable. At exactly 300 p.m., the staff gathered in the grand dining hall. The room, usually filled with the city's elite enjoying fine dining, now housed a group of confused employees exchanging puzzled glances. The polished wooden floors gleamed under the dimmed chandeliers, and the rich scent of freshly baked bread still lingered in the air. The air was heavy with anticipation. Richard Bennett, the head chef, leaned against a table, arms crossed, his expression a mix of irritation and boredom. "What's this about?" He muttered to a fellow chef. "We have prep work to finish. I don't have time for some pointless meeting." Several other employees shared his sentiment, whispering among themselves. They all assumed this was just another routine management change, another corporate figurehead stepping in to shuffle policies before fading into the background. The servers fidgeted with their aprons, glancing at the door. Some line cooks exchanged looks, clearly wondering why the kitchen had been brought to a halt in the middle of the afternoon rush. Then, the double doors swung open. Marcus Carter walked in, still wearing his delivery uniform. At first, the staff barely reacted. Some looked toward the door, expecting someone of actual importance to follow behind him. Others barely acknowledged his presence, assuming he had simply walked in by mistake. Then the murmuring started. "Wait, what's he doing here?" A few employees exchanged amused glances, and soon a ripple of chuckles spread across the room. Richard Bennett smirked, shaking his head. He turned to his sous chef and said just loud enough for everyone to hear, "Let me guess, he's here to apply for a janitor job." The comment sent laughter through the crowd, a low wave of mockery. Even some of the waitstaff, who had been quieter during the morning's events, joined in, whispering and smirking. The arrogance in the room was palpable. Marcus, however, did not react. His posture remained calm, his expression unreadable. He stepped forward, letting the noise settle. He wasn't in a hurry. The moment would reveal itself soon enough. Slowly, the laughter died down. Marcus scanned the room, meeting the eyes of those who had mocked him just moments ago. When he spoke, his voice was even, but it carried a weight that demanded attention. "I'm Marcus Carter, and as of 3 weeks ago, I am the new owner of Astoria Prime." A thick silence fell over the room. The expressions on the employees' faces shifted from amusement to confusion, then to sheer disbelief. Richard Bennett's smirk vanished instantly. His arms, once confidently crossed, slowly dropped to his sides. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. A server near the back of the room blinked rapidly, looking between Marcus and a co-worker as if seeking confirmation that this was all some kind of prank. A waitress, who had laughed the loudest earlier, clutched her notepad tighter, as if hoping it would anchor her in this unsettling reality. "What?" someone finally muttered, barely audible. Marcus let the silence stretch. He wanted them to feel it, the weight of their assumptions, the harsh realization that they had misjudged him not once but multiple times. He watched as it settled in. The confusion, the embarrassment, the regret. Then, finally, Richard Bennett spoke. "That's not possible," he scoffed, shaking his head. His voice lacked its usual arrogance, though he tried to mask it. "You're joking, right?" Marcus didn't laugh. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a folder and held it up. Inside were signed contracts, purchase agreements, and ownership papers. He placed them on the table in front of him. "I don't joke about business," Marcus said simply. The weight of the truth crashed down like a thunderclap. Some employees shifted uncomfortably. Others stared at the documents as if they could somehow change what they had just heard. A young chef, who had been one of the first to mock Marcus earlier that day, lowered his gaze to the floor. The same waitress who had wrinkled her nose at him that morning now couldn't look him in the eye. The energy in the room was unlike anything they had experienced before. Marcus let them sit with their discomfort. Then he took a slow step forward. "I spent this morning watching you, listening to you, learning exactly how this place operates when you think no one important is paying attention." Several employees winced at the reminder. "Some of you treated me with decency," Marcus continued, "but many of you didn't. You judged me the moment I walked through those kitchen doors." His eyes settled briefly on Richard Bennett. "You assumed I was less than you. You spoke about me as if I wasn't even in the room, and yet here I stand as your employer." The tension in the room was suffocating. Marcus could see it, the way some of them clenched their fists, the way others swallowed hard, unable to deny what he was saying. "This restaurant is known for its exclusivity," Marcus continued, "but exclusivity should never mean exclusion, and from today forward things will change." Nobody dared to challenge him. Not now. Not after what they had just learned. For the first time that day, Marcus saw something new in their expressions. It wasn't just shock, it was shame, and it was exactly what they needed to feel. The silence in Astoria Prime's grand dining hall stretched on like an eternity. Moments ago, the employees had laughed, whispered, and sneered at Marcus Carter. Now that laughter had died completely, leaving behind only shame and discomfort. Marcus stood firm in the center of the room, his posture calm yet commanding. He did not smirk or gloat. He did not revel in their embarrassment. This was not about revenge. It was about setting a standard. He let the weight of the moment sink in. Then, in a voice neither raised nor harsh, he began to speak. "I am not here to fire people out of anger. I am not here to punish you for your words this morning, but I am here to make one thing very clear: things will change." His voice was steady, unwavering. He had their full attention now. Marcus scanned the room, his eyes locking onto different employees one by one. "I have seen firsthand how you treat those you believe are beneath you," he said, his tone measured but firm, "and it's unacceptable." Several people looked down at the floor. Others clenched their jaws as if wanting to protest, but none dared speak. "Respect isn't just reserved for VIP guests," Marcus continued. "It should exist in every role within this restaurant. That includes the dishwashers, the delivery workers, the janitors, and every person who makes this place function." A few employees shuffled uncomfortably. Marcus could see some of them beginning to realize the truth of his words. They had built a hierarchy in their minds, one where people like him, like so many others, were simply there to serve. Now they were being forced to confront the ugliness of that mindset. Marcus turned slightly, facing Richard Bennett directly. The head chef, usually full of arrogance and bravado, now stood silent, his arms hanging at his sides. His face had lost its usual smug expression. "Chef Bennett," Marcus said, his voice neutral, "you run this kitchen like a dictatorship, but I wonder, would you still command that same respect if your employees knew how easily you dismiss them?" Bennett's jaw tightened, but he remained quiet. Marcus took a step forward, closing the distance between them. He wasn't threatening, just deliberate. "The way you treat your staff, the way you spoke to me today, says more about you than it does about anyone else." Bennett finally spoke, his voice quieter than before. "I was just trying to maintain standards." Marcus nodded. "Good. Then let's talk about new standards." The tension in the room was palpable. Marcus turned back to the rest of the staff, his gaze sweeping across the room. "From this day forward, Astoria Prime will not be a place where people are valued based on their job title, the uniform they wear, or the color of their skin." Some employees visibly stiffened at those last words. Marcus caught a few employees exchanging guilty glances. "You will treat each other with professionalism and respect, or you will not work here at all." A sharp silence filled the space. Marcus let his words settle. "This isn't a threat. It's a reality," he continued. "If you cannot change your mindset, this isn't the right place for you." Some employees finally understood. A young hostess who had previously snickered at Marcus now stared at her hands, avoiding his gaze. A dishwasher near the back straightened his posture, clearly moved by Marcus' words. One of the younger servers, Lewis, a Hispanic employee who had always been treated as less than by some of the senior staff, gave a slight nod. Not everyone, however, seemed willing to change. A waiter near the front crossed his arms, scowling. "So what? We're just supposed to pretend like everything's fine. We have jobs to do." Marcus didn't miss a beat. "Yes, you have jobs to do, and those jobs include treating everyone here like a human being. If that's too difficult for you, let me know now. I'll make sure today is your last shift." The waiter quickly shut his mouth. Marcus turned back to Richard Bennett one last time. "You are the head of this kitchen, Bennett," he said evenly. "But leadership isn't about barking orders. It's about setting an example." Bennett exhaled, looking down. His arrogance had cracked. Marcus knew the chef would need time to fully grasp what had happened today. For years he had run this kitchen unchecked. Now he had been humbled in front of everyone. Finally, after a long pause, Bennett nodded stiffly. "Understood." Marcus took a step back, letting his final words sink in. Astoria Prime is changing. The question is, will you change with it? No one spoke. They had no choice but to reflect on the lesson they had just learned. For the first time, Astoria Prime didn't just feel exclusive, it felt accountable. And that was exactly what Marcus had set out to do. A heavy silence filled the grand dining hall of Astoria Prime as Marcus Carter's final words echoed through the space. The tension that had once been fueled by arrogance and mockery was now replaced with something different: introspection. Many employees stood motionless, processing everything that had unfolded over the past hour. The hierarchy they had built in their minds, the invisible lines separating those who belonged from those who didn't, had been shattered. Marcus took a measured breath, then shifted the conversation to what mattered next. Marcus placed his hands on the polished wooden table at the front of the room and spoke clearly, his voice steady and deliberate. From today forward, Astoria Prime will not operate as it has in the past. A ripple of uncertainty spread through the staff. Some glanced at each other, uncertain of what that meant. Others, like Richard Bennett, the once arrogant head chef, kept their gazes low, unwilling to meet Marcus' eyes. Respect and professionalism will be at the core of this establishment, Marcus continued. I don't care if you've worked here for 10 years or 10 days. If you cannot embody those values, then you will not work here at all. The weight of his words settled deep into the room. One of the older waiters, a man named Greg, crossed his arms and scoffed. And what if we don't like these changes? He challenged. Some of us have been running this place for years. We know what works. Marcus met his stare without blinking. Then I suggest you find another restaurant that still tolerates discrimination, Marcus replied simply, because it won't happen here anymore. A few gasps rippled through the crowd. Greg's confidence faltered and he looked away, scowling. He knew he had no defense. No one else spoke. They knew Marcus wasn't making empty threats. Amidst the discomfort, Marcus saw something else in the crowd: hope. He caught sight of Lewis, a young server who had been bullied by his peers. Earlier that day, Lewis had been ignored and pushed aside by senior staff. Now his posture had changed. He was standing taller, his eyes no longer downcast. Marcus turned to him and spoke, ensuring that every word was loud and clear. Some of you have been overlooked, mistreated, and ignored simply because others decided you weren't good enough, Marcus said, scanning the room. That ends today. Lewis blinked in shock. A few other young employees, dishwashers, hostesses, and line cooks, also looked up, their expressions a mix of disbelief and cautious optimism. For the first time, they were being seen. Marcus gestured toward the staff. From now on, promotions and opportunities will be earned, not handed out based on favoritism or bias. If you work hard, you will be recognized. If you have ambition, you will be supported. The tone of the room changed. Some employees looked resentful, realizing that their unchecked authority was slipping away. But others, especially those who had been treated unfairly, now stood a little straighter. For them, this was a chance, a fresh start. Marcus let the room sit in silence for a few moments before continuing. I understand that change is difficult, he acknowledged, and I'm not here to erase everything you've built. I'm here to improve it. He turned to Richard Bennett, who had remained silent throughout the meeting. Bennett, Marcus addressed him directly. This is your kitchen. You've spent years running it, and I respect that. But this culture, the toxicity, that ends now. Either you adjust or you step aside. Bennett, for once, didn't argue. Instead, after a long pause, he gave a slow, reluctant nod. Understood. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Marcus turned back to the rest of the staff, taking one last sweeping look at the employees who now stood at a crossroads. Some would rise to the challenge, some would resist change, some might leave, and that was fine. This wasn't just about running a restaurant, it was about building something better. He took a deep breath and spoke his final words. Respect costs nothing, but without it you can lose everything. The weight of that statement hung in the air. Nobody spoke. Marcus didn't need them to. He had said everything that needed to be said. With that, he turned and walked out of the dining hall, leaving the employees to process everything that had just transpired. This story is about more than just a restaurant. It's about how we see and treat others in our daily lives. Marcus Carter's journey teaches us a powerful lesson. Respect is free, but its absence can cost everything. The employees at Astoria Prime judged Marcus by his appearance and job, assuming he was unworthy of basic dignity. But respect should not be reserved for people in power. It should be given to everyone, from the highest-ranking executive to the person cleaning the floors. True leadership is not about control, it's about creating change. Marcus had every right to punish those who disrespected him, but instead, he chose transformation over revenge. He set new standards, proving that a leader's strength comes not from fear, but from their ability to inspire growth. People reveal who they are when they think no one is watching. The way the employees treated Marcus when they assumed he was just a delivery man exposed their real character. It's a reminder that how we treat people, especially those who can do nothing for us, defines who we truly are. Opportunities should be earned, not decided by bias. In many workplaces and communities, hardworking people get overlooked because of favoritism and prejudice. Marcus made sure that talent and effort, not connections or privilege, determined success at Astoria Prime. Change is uncomfortable, but it's necessary. Not everyone in the restaurant adapted to the new culture. Some people left, unwilling to grow. But those who stayed learned a valuable truth. Growth requires letting go of old ways and embracing a new mindset.